I'm going to introduce our honored guest, Dr. Jamison Green, who's told me that I can refer to him as James on colloquially. So hi, James.
Hi, Emma.
Hi.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, and we're so glad to have you. I originally met you a couple years ago at Out and Equal Workplace Summit. You were giving a seminar, co-hosting a seminar on aging as a trans person, and I thought that was great. And I think I came up to you afterwards and said hello. That was a really great workshop.
Thank you.
You've also been very involved with WPATH and so forth. So you're an author, you're a policy consultant, you're a legislative provocateur, as you say, as well as a public speaker. Your book, Becoming a Visible Man, which is, quote, the first memoir by a trans man, recently just released its second edition last year.
And there it is.
Awesome. And I'll allow you to tell folks more about that book. I'm just going to you can learn more about Dr. Green's book by going to his website, www.jamisongreen.com. And I'll put that there in the chat, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
Oh, the book is it's partly a memoir and partly an educational tool. It's meant to basically elucidate all the questions that people keep asking over and over and over again. What is the difference between sex and gender? What do trans men do medically that's different from trans women? What do trans men and trans women have in common? What is, what did your parents think? Do you have kids? What do your kids think? All those questions that people keep asking all the time. So I put it all together and try to make it as engaging as possible. And it did really well for Vanderbilt University Press, which is the publisher. And so that's why they decided to put it out in a second edition, which gave me an opportunity to update it a bit and talk about some of the legislative changes that have happened since the first edition came out in 2004. And so it was a great opportunity. And so I'm really excited about it. And they're also going to let me do an audio book, which I'm in the process of recording, and hopefully it'll be out by Christmas time. That would be nice to get it out before the end of this year.
Yeah, and that way everybody can go order it online.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, and it sounds like it's a book for everybody too.
It was intended to be. It focuses on trans men, of course, but it's really much broader than that, in the sense that gender applies to all of us, and the same kinds of rights issues apply to all of us. So.
Right. Excellent. Well, so first, I'd like you to just kind of introduce yourself, tell us how you identify and what your pronouns are. And then we're going to jump into the conversation of your personal journey through transition.
Okay. Well, I identify as male. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I transitioned in 1988. And I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and where I was born also. And I was always very androgynous appearing. Even when I was small, people would ask me if I was a boy or a girl, and I had to wear dresses to school from day one all the way through high school. There was no exceptions. And that was very difficult for me. I didn't have any language for how I felt, what my difference was from other people, but I was very clear I was not like the other girls, and I was not like the other boys either. So I would spend a lot of time trying to figure all that out. And I was a month before my 40th birthday was when I started my medical transition. But I struggled with this business from earliest childhood. Certainly. So I know a lot of people can identify with that. And that was my case as well.
Yeah. So, did you, paint a picture of what you already said that there was no language. And I can understand what that's like. I often tell folks, the same thing as I was growing up, feeling othered, feeling like I was different. I literally used to tell people I was from another planet. And, also not having that word transgender at that point to describe it. But for, the time that you were growing up and realizing this, paint kind of a picture of what things were like back then.
Well, I was born in 1948. It was the 1950s. It was the Stepford Wives. It was, whatever. It was just keeping up with the Joneses. Everybody was trying to be the same or better than their neighbors. And my parents were actually really, really down to earth, very wonderful people who believed that children should be able to have a childhood. And as a result, I was able to change my clothes to clothing that I really liked when I got home, and I was able to play as vigorously and as roughly as I wanted to. And I built tree houses and was captain of the neighborhood baseball team and captain of the neighborhood football team and leader of the neighborhood gang, such as they were in those days. We were very mild in terms of gang activities. We didn't do much. We just sort of walked around. But, I think Christine Jorgensen transitioned and became pretty famous in 1952. But there were no visible trans men. And up until, until the mid 70s, I had no idea that it was even possible, feasible, technically doable to actually transition from female to male.
Certainly. Yeah. And I was doing the math there. So it's probably the late 80s when you began your medical transition.
Yeah, 1988.
Yeah. So, we're going to definitely talk tonight about your expertise. You were involved with the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare for a very long time. In fact, weren't you the director of that for
I was
or something like that?
Well, I was on the board of directors. I was first elected to the board of directors in 2003. And I was reelected 4 years later to a second term. And 4 years after that, I was elected president, which is a 6-year commitment. So, and then because of when the meetings fell, my whole total term on the board extended to 15 years. And that's all volunteer time and commitment. So
wow. Yeah. And some of the things that WPATH is known for is like the standards of care, which best practices in healthcare kind of inform insurance providers and healthcare providers on, medical transition. So we're definitely going to get into that, especially because as you transition in the workplace, you start maybe having questions about, oh, well, can I feasibly afford to do a medical transition? And so we'll jump into a discussion about that and what you know about that. But, and we'll also probably talk about your knowledge on, best practices around workplace transitioning. But what was it like for you? Did you transition in the workplace? I didn't. I got kind of lucky. I ended up losing my job right after I came out. I became an Uber driver for a while, so I could just go total andro the whole time. And then I got hired after I had about a year under my belt. So I was lucky. So what was it like transitioning for you?
Oh, it was interesting. I actually determined that it was time and I was ready to go through this process. So I applied to the sex reassignment program at Stanford University, which was not really technically at Stanford anymore. It was across the street, but the surgeon who ran that program was a professor at Stanford. But I had one job. I was the vice president of operations of a small software development company. We only had like 40 employees. I figured everybody knew me. They all understood me. I wouldn't have any trouble at all transitioning on the job. However, about a week after I sent my application in to the sex reassignment program, all the vice presidents got laid off. So I was suddenly without a job. And I went through the whole evaluation process at the same time I was looking very hard for another job, because I had a partner and we had we had one child and another child on the way, and I was the sole source of support. So I needed to keep that money rolling in. And I landed on Sun Microsystems, and it was interviewed for 2 different positions. I had 40 separate interviews at Sun Microsystems. 40. Yeah. And one day I had 12 interviews in one day. I mean, it was just a grueling process. But finally, I was offered one of the positions. And by that time, all of my evaluation process with the sex reassignment program had happened. I hadn't received the final word that I was going to be accepted in the program, but I was pretty sure I would. And so the first day on the job, I was hired in as a manager, one of the managers in technical publications, which was quite a large operation at that group. And I was in charge of system software documentation. And that would be my starting position. And I would have 12 writers working for me, 8 men and 4 women. And we shared a building with the group that was the other group that I had interviewed with, which was software engineers in the graphics department. So I was at the very first day was orientation, and a group, they were hiring people like crazy. And so there was a big group, like 50 people, who were all going through processing and orientation at the same time from all these different departments. And we had to bring our proof of citizenship. And so I had my passport, which had my feminine name, and it had a little F on it. And they would call us up one at a time to show our passport or our proof of citizenship during the whole process. And I went up and I gave them the document, and they checked off my name and stuff. And then they gave it back to me and said, thank you very much, Mr. Green. And I thought,
wow.
oh, okay. And I decided at that moment, because the next thing that we were going to be doing was filling out our paperwork for our insurance coverage and things, that I was going to fill out all my paperwork mail.
Awesome.
So I just did that because I figured I would have less trouble if I didn't get accepted to the sex reassignment program, going to HR and saying, I don't understand why all my paperwork says male.
Right.
Looking as masculine as I did, they would panic, of course, and they would quick, oh, we'll fix that right away. But I didn't have to do that, fortunately. But what I did have to do the next day, I report to my office, and I'm sitting down with my manager, and he says, oh, I'm so excited you're here. I can't wait to send out email to the whole company, 10,000 people, tell everyone how wonderful you are. And I said, well, I kind of like it if, we could kind of I'd like to keep a low profile for a little while. And he looks at me and I said, well, I may be a candidate for surgical sex reassignment. That means I would have to change my pronouns. That means you'd start seeing me in the men's room, and I would just rather not have to explain that to 10,000 people. I'd rather explain it just to the local group here. And, it'll be probably a few weeks before, it could be any day now, I'll find out. And then at that point, I'll start using the men's room and masculine pronouns,
Right.
And he goes, my boss goes, and he sits there for a minute and then he says, how long will you be out?
Oh,
and
no.
I said, it's no big deal. Just say, down the road, I'll be out for a couple of weeks for chest reconstruction. And then about a year after that, and that'd be about 6 months down the road. And then about a year after that or so, I might be out for a month for genital reconstruction. And that's about it. No big deal.
Yeah. Right.
And he goes, oh, okay. He says, do I have to say anything to anybody? I said, no, you don't.
Nice.
All I need from you is your support and your, using the correct pronouns, and, just just treat me like anybody else. And he goes, okay. When I did tell him 7 weeks later, when I got word that I could go through the program, he said, okay, fine. And then he never used a pronoun in reference to me. Never. He always said my name.
Interesting.
Yeah. And after a while, all the writers in the group said, you know, you were only making yourself look stupid. Lighten up. To him, they said, you know, and
sure.
and so it went pretty smoothly as far as that goes. Although there were some people in the other group that we shared our building with who didn't know me really, and I didn't have any need to have a relationship with them, but gossip traveled and they heard there was a transsexual in the building.
Right.
And at one point, I thought, well, I better talk to somebody in that group. I better, you know, just make sure they know who I am and that it's okay. And coincidentally, right then I found out that the HR director for that group, and I'd never met the HR director for my own group, the HR director for the graphics group was someone that I had worked with at a prior company for 5 years.
Okay.
And so I went to her and said, hey, I didn't know you were working here too. You know, let's go to lunch, you know, let's catch up. And so we did. And I told her the whole story. And she was like, oh, well, that makes all the sense in the world. Of course you're going to transition. This is, mind you, this is 1988.
Right.
There's no conversation in the larger society about transness at all. Nothing.
And what I'm trying to understand is, like, you're saying that this is a program for sex reassignment, right?
Yep. That's what it was called.
But it's like, you know, for trans people, right? Like that's, and yet you were facing situations where there might have been a little bit of, like, you know, passive transphobia. I mean, sounds like so. Overt transphobia, but you know, it's very interesting. It gets at that idea that there's, I've often wondered, like, you know, because you talk about like gatekeepers in the medical community and then the insurance provider community and you know, the standards of care and the ICD and just it kind of asks or begs the question, like, why are they doing it if it's not to help affirm trans people?
Well, they felt that affirming trans people was that binary transition.
Right.
And they were really, really trying to help people.
Okay.
But they were biased in that way. And that's one of the reasons that I joined WPATH, which at the time was called HBIGDA, Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, HBIGDA.
Right. Yeah.
Because I thought the standards of care were horrible and that they weren't doing a good job and that their biases were harming people. But they, you know, they needed to be educated about that.
Certainly. And, you know, I'd like to talk about that. But first, you know, let's fast forward. So, you know, we've heard a little bit about your transition now. In 2021, you know, we've got folks who identify as transgender and binary. We've got folks who identify as non-binary and gender expansive. And, you know, I really am only an expert on my own story and my own journey. You know, as are you, but, you know, being that you've got expertise in this field, I'd love to hear you kind of talk about what has changed and what would a person who is considering a social and or medical transition, who is trying to figure out, what am I going to do about work? You know, because you've got certain considerations. You got people who know your old name. You've got people who are used to using different pronouns per se. You've got this internalized transphobia, possibly, of like, oh my God, I don't have passability, stuff like that. So what has changed in the 21st century? What kind of things should a person look for in their job to help them feel better about transitioning in the workplace?
Well, I think the first thing to look at is, what is their policy, their non-discrimination policy at the company actually say? Because if they're including gender identity and expression, they have to include non-binary people. They have to include androgynous people. They have to be cognizant that people are not going to conform to the binary system. And that's because I lived in a non-binary way for 40 years. um, I went through a whole lot of stuff to prove myself on the various jobs that I got, and get people to realize that just because I wasn't a typical woman didn't mean I wasn't capable of in anything. And just because I wasn't a typical man, didn't mean I wasn't capable of anything. So it's, I think the first thing to do is look at the non-discrimination policy. But then the other thing that's really, really important, and this has been the case from the beginning of my awareness of this and all the way through to the current times, and doing education about this all the way through those times, is in watching policies change and helping policies change. Relationships at work, your relationships at work are the foundation for whatever changes you need to make for yourself. If you have good working relationships with people, they're going to be more positively disposed toward you. If your relationships are superficial, if they are if you're way distant because you're afraid of anybody knowing who you are, that could be a problem for you down the road. Really, really having strong relationships where it's not like you have to be going out drinking or whatever it is people do after work, or hanging around with everybody, and everybody's not going to be your best friend. That's not it. It's making people aware that you are competent, capable, trustworthy, and kind and caring about them. They will reciprocate for the most part. There's going to be jerks everywhere. You're going to run into people who, you're what? And all of a sudden they hate you. That's going to happen. But the more people you have around you who are understanding and who can go, wow, that's really amazing. I'd like to know more about that, and not attack you, then the better off you're going to be. Certainly. But always, when you're at work, stay focused on work.
Right.
And those work relationships.
That's really good advice. I've heard that too. Like, I know a couple where I work, it's super supportive of trans people. They really empower the couple of us who work there who are out to, be voices and advocate for ourselves, and also help to invite folks to be allies and teach them about what it means to be an ally. In speaking with folks who have transitioned in the workplace, I've heard, often, so a lot of companies, they will actually now have like transition guidelines. So in addition to that non-discrimination policy, there may be transition guidelines. And all transition guidelines, I think they'll say, talk to HR, then talk to your manager, then come up with a plan and have a strategy. Are you familiar with any kind of recommendations from WPATH? Or I also know you do work with the Human Rights Campaign and Corporate Equality Index. So what kind of recommendations can you make in regard to those types of things?
Well, it used to be, the plan, it used to put a big burden on the employee, the transitioning employee. And often, and I've always counseled against this, transitioning employees should not be in charge of educating people about themselves. They should not, the burden of doing that should not be on the employee. And I know there are some individuals who want to do that and who feel like they don't trust anybody else to educate. They'd rather take care of it themselves. But honestly, you can tell your own story till you're blue in the face, but that may not be educational for the people around you. And educating is a different art. And so I encourage individuals to help HR vet the people who are going to do education, rather than take on the education yourself. It gives people an opportunity to choose not to be in the room when education is happening, which some people may choose to do that, some people may not, and that should be an option for the employee. The company shouldn't make that decision for you. That because sometimes people will ask questions that they wouldn't want to ask in front of you.
Certainly. Yeah,
because they're going to have to see you every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's one thing. But the other thing is, I don't think it's right to put the burden on the employee, and all of this stuff about your transition plan, and that they have to know when this and that's going to happen, especially if you're especially if you're non-binary, especially if you're not doing a medical transition where you're going to have to schedule time off. That's nobody's business. It's just nobody's business. They don't need to ask you any questions. You don't need to report anything. You should just notify them what day you're going to change your nameplate, your email address, whatever documents you have that you want to change for anything in that regard. But otherwise, it should be very, very low key.
Sure. So what about people? So I think the both of us, it sounds like we've kind of been lucky to work in places where there is an HR department. For 12 years, I worked in the restaurant industry. And while a lot of those are corporations that have an HR at corporate HQ, it seems very far away from where you actually do your physical work. So, what would your thoughts be on somebody who may not have to feel like they have direct access to HR, or work in an industry that is very, maybe sexist or oriented to one, gender or another?
Well, there are going to be some environments where things are going to be hard no matter what the policy is, because you're distant from anybody in authority who has any understanding. And that is a problem. And it can happen that people will, just refuse to accept you. And sometimes you have to change jobs in those situations.
Certainly.
But if you're in a situation like that, where if they do at corporate have a policy, you can check that out usually through the website, or you can make an inquiry with at the home office, and then you need to ask very gently your manager, the person in charge at that location where you work, and say, there's a policy at corporate that supports transgender people, and I'm one of them. And I want to be sure that I have your support, because I like to work here. I enjoy my working relationship with you. I enjoy my working relationship with my coworkers. I'm say you're a server. I am a people person. I love to make people happy by bringing them their food, and I don't want to have to leave. So I want to know that you're going to have my back, and I'm going to try to make this as painful for everybody as possible.
As painless.
Excuse me. As oh yeah, thank you.
Yes. Just making sure.
Freudian slip. Thank you.
No, that's certainly.
So,
and I mean,
try to keep this from being painful for everyone.
Yes. It's already painful enough, right? No,
exactly. Yeah.
And it's, and corporate policies aside, the reality is, we live in a world where, and in a country where, we know the unfortunate statistics on murder related to transphobia.
Yeah.
And we've been dragged into this culture war. You mentioned how in the 80s, you didn't really face a whole lot of backlash. It's kind of interesting that when you start to see progression, you also start to see kind of the opposition mounting up on the other side. And so, what are your thoughts on if somebody's kind of living in an area where okay, I've got the corporate, they back me up, but I also know that a lot of the people who work next to me or alongside me, they probably are of a different persuasion. ideally, I think somebody would like be able to change jobs, but what if, that's not an option necessarily?
Yeah, I know it's not, you can't tell somebody, oh, just change your job. That's often next to impossible. Um, I think, again, it comes down to relationships. And if you find that you're rubbing up against somebody the wrong way, that they're having a bad reaction to you, you draw on that past history that you have together and try to get them to see that you're not changing that much, in that respect. You're here to do your job. You want to get along. This is not a threat to them. Um, they can, they can ask you any question you want, but they don't. It's not helping anybody for them to be beating you up verbally, emotionally, whatever.
Right.
It's just appeal to their better nature and look for support among your coworkers or management up the chain if as much as you can.
Yeah.
It can be hard. It can really be hard. I know I did have an incident when I transitioned. I mean, I made it sound like it was all easy, but there was a guy in the other group that we shared our office with that went to his HR person, who happened to be the woman that I knew. And unfortunately, this was after she and I had lunch together. And he said, I don't want that woman in my bathroom. And she goes, there's no woman in your bathroom. And then she wasn't even thinking of me. She just, there's no woman in your bathroom. That was just a reaction. And then he said, no, I'm serious. I can't stand this. And I don't want that woman using the men's room. And if I see her in there, I could get violent. And she realizes he's talking about me, and she says, he is under medical supervision. He's going through a very complicated, interesting process. He'd be happy to explain it to you if you were interested. But if you touch him, you're out of here. And he has a lot of friends. That's what she said.
Wow.
And then he protested one more time, and she said, all right, we'll get you a porta potty. She said, he can use any men's room he likes. We'll get you a porta potty and put it in the parking lot.
Wow. I love it.
I know. That was 1988.
Wow.
That was forward thinking on her part, because nobody coached her.
Certainly. Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's amazing. But it's the scary reality though, is that there's people who think that way. I mean, I still, I go into where I work, we have gender neutral restrooms everywhere in our buildings. We're very lucky to have those. In fact, the company is building a new headquarters, and they even asked our employee resource group for input on some of the facilities. So we asked to have napkin receptacles in all restrooms, regardless of what gender is on the
Good.
door. And and there's all gender facilities in the fitness center and the showers, as well as the restrooms. But I still I get static from people still walking in the restroom.
There are people who are just not going to like it.
Right. But the thing is of course, if there is a policy, then at least you get that, and then you keep mentioning relationships. I really think that's an important one.
Right. And if your company is supportive of trans people, and you keep running into someone who is harassing or consistently abrasive, report it.
Yeah.
Because they can discipline that person or
Certainly.
educate them, or both.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I've had a couple of experiences like that where unfortunately I have had to say something to HR, but I'm, like I said, I'm lucky to have had, they've got my back. But what if somebody, so let's say somebody, as we're going through transition, or as we're kind of on that precipice where like we're finally, for you it was 40 years, for me it was 36 years. We're on that, just at that point where like we know it's bound to happen, right? And we've got all these things going through our head about, again, passability and pronouns and names and bathrooms and so forth. But, what if somebody is kind of thinking, all right, maybe doing it here isn't my best option. I think I'm going to go look somewhere else for a job. What kind of things would you recommend they do as they're on that job search, looking for a place to work that they feel safe, can feel safe transitioning and coming out?
Well, a lot of trans positive companies will advertise that on their website. They won't make a secret of it.
Mm-hmm.
So look really closely at a company that you're targeting, and go as deep into their website as you can and find all of those telltale documents that they will make public. And if you can, talk to people who work there. If you can, just even if it's you hang around outside the door and pick somebody you think looks nice and say, excuse me, could I just ask you a couple of questions about working here? I'm trying to apply for a job, and I'd just like to get your take on things. And
it's a good idea.
Strike up a conversation.
And these days too, like LinkedIn, I just kind of thought about my LinkedIn profile. Like I've got the pride flag as my banner on LinkedIn, and maybe looking for folks on LinkedIn who work at a prospective employer.
Absolutely, that's a good idea.
Yeah. So also, obviously for a lot of folks, not everybody, for a lot of us, we consider, certain aspects of medical transition. And, you might be wondering, does my current employer even offer trans-related healthcare? I'd like to hear you talk about your work on this, the ICD, the standards of care. Where were we and where have we come? Where are we?
Well, when I finally did start at Sun Microsystems and I got my insurance documents, which was after I'd signed all the paperwork, I remember sitting in my office looking at the exclusions and realizing, oh, I can't access my health coverage. The number 17, big exclusion, no services will be provided in support of any gender change, sex change, transition, and now, boom, blanket, nothing. And so broadly constructed, that sentence, that a bigoted provider could apply that to any medical condition whatsoever, simply with the knowledge that I was trans myself.
Wow.
So I thought, and again, this is 1988, I thought, how can I change that? I have no leverage here. What can I do? And in 1992, I started working with the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, trying to educate within the Human Rights Commission about who trans people were, and that San Francisco needed a non-discrimination ordinance that would protect trans people, and that the Human Rights Commission needed to be able to respond when trans people had complaints of human rights violations. And it took 2 years before we were able to convince the Human Rights Commission and the Board of Supervisors to hold a public hearing on discrimination against transgender people. So that happened in 1994. I was given the contract, I was awarded the contract to write up the report from that public hearing. And so I analyzed the public testimony, analyzed everything, and wrote this document that basically said, okay, here are the 28 things that are wrong that trans people are complaining about, and here are the 30 things that San Francisco as a municipality and an employer can do to change those things, to make trans people's lives better. The very first thing was we need a non-discrimination ordinance. And they asked me to sit down with the city attorney and write it so that it would say the right thing. Because I said, no, it should not say transsexuals. It should not say transgender people. It should talk about gender identity and expression, because everybody has that, everybody. And you don't have to have an identity label. You don't have to say I'm transsexual or I'm transgender. You have, whether you like it or not, a gender identity and a gender expression, which can be interpreted or misinterpreted by other people. And you should not be penalized for anyone's misinterpretation or interpretation of your gender identity. So as soon as the mayor signed that ordinance into law, I turned to the Human Rights Commission people and said, guess what? Now you're in violation of your equal benefits ordinance. The equal benefits ordinance was San Francisco's flagship legislation that back in the 80s had made domestic partner insurance coverage law of the land. I mean, it made it desirable for most companies to include domestic partner coverage. Prior to that, there were no companies that offered domestic partner coverage.
Wow.
So I knew if I could get the city of San Francisco behind this, we could do something. It then took 6 years of advocacy with meetings with union people and different city officials and this and that for 6 years before we finally convinced the city to drop the exclusion from one of the 5 plans that they offered employees and make trans benefits accessible through this other plan, through this one plan. And at that point, we only knew for sure that there were 12 trans people who were employed by the city.
Okay.
That we knew of.
Right.
There may have been many others, who knows? But anyway, and I kept saying, this should not cost anything. There should be no fees associated with this. This is ordinary health care. Other people get this kind of care. It's only when you find out that the person's trans that they can't have it.
Yeah.
Now, it might be called something different. It might be tweaked slightly differently, whatever. But all those surgical procedures, hormones, mental health benefits, all that stuff is available. It's just that we're singling out this one group of people and this one diagnosis and saying, nope, we're not covering that.
Right. Well,
And so then we took them another several years to get actuarial data. And this is one of the reasons why I went after the city, because they have sunshine laws. They have to share their data.
right.
So they had collected over $5 million in a period of like 3 or 4 years on this benefit, against this benefit. And I had said it's not going to cost anything. And in that period of time, they paid out $156,000. So they stopped charging for it. Based on that, the entire University of California system, which is 10 campuses across the state with faculty, staff, and students, all had exclusions removed from all plans and no charge, no extra charge, no premium to the people and who are paying for the insurance, no extra charge to the insurance to the university from the insurance companies.
Right. Well, so you're talking, you raise a good point when you talk about doing it on like the city level, because, today we don't have like a nationwide policy. WPATH is a recommendation. The standards of care are a recommendation, right?
Well, they're not, and they don't address insurance. They don't address
Right.
payment systems at all. The standards of care basically justify the medical necessity of the treatment.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah.
And that opens the door to insurance. Without those standards of care, we wouldn't have gotten what we have now, even though
Right.
what we have now is still not good enough.
Sure.
And standards also still need to be improved. And we've now gotten, because of the city of San Francisco and the Corporate Equality Index through the Human Rights Campaign, or the Human Rights Campaign Foundation and Workplace Project,
Mhm.
through that, we've got the majority of Fortune 500 companies and lots of small companies that who want to be scored on that corporate equality index, and they, to get 100%, have to offer trans inclusive coverage.
Yeah.
And that has opened it up. And then because of that, and because of improvements in the standards of care, in 2014, Medicare removed their exclusion, and that opened state Medicaid programs up to remove exclusions and offer trans inclusive care. So that's how it happened.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
You mentioned the workplace project, and I'm familiar with Port New Stanford and Raina, forget her last name, but they work for their workplace at hrc.org.
Right.
And I would suggest that if anybody has questions, HRC does a really good job of keeping tabs on corporations and employers that do a good job. I know my employer has earned a score of 100 on their CEI for the last several years. And definitely trans-related healthcare and trans or workplace transition are hot topics right now in the discourse. We don't have, as I said before, a nationwide law protecting trans folks and folks.
Well, we do.
Well, kind of, right. Yeah, go ahead, talk about it.
in last year, in June of 2020, the Bostock decision was decided by the Supreme Court,
right,
which opened sexual orientation and gender identity are now included under Title VII. The EEOC has been very trans positive for much longer. And so, but now that Title VII, the statute basically is trans inclusive, and that means we have won that. That doesn't, however, just because a company has 100% or just because Bostock is there doesn't mean that corporate cultures change overnight and that individual attitudes change. We still have a long, long way to go to get the culture to change. And as you can see from the legislative track record in the past year at the state level, with people trying to stop everything in terms of trans healthcare for young people and trans participation in athletics and everything they can think of, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, certainly. Well, and speaking of having a long way to go in corporate cultures and even cultures among employees, we had somebody from the audience who said, some people work in a situation where the company may not have an affirming policy, in spite of Bostock, or procedures related to transitioning for employees. In some places, employees have had to actually help write the transition guidelines because they were the person to go through that.
Yep.
Maybe that, somebody's unable to switch employers readily. So what kind of external resources or actions are available? Because Bostock covers discrimination in the workplace, under certain codified language, but doesn't cover everything. So what would your suggestions be on that?
Well, the best thing to do, I think, I don't know if it's the best thing to do, is one good thing you could do is take some of the resources on the HRC Workplace Project website with you and sit down with, and again, build those relationships at work, sit down with the person who has the highest level position with whom you have a good rapport and say, I need to have you look at this. I really hope that you can review this and talk with me about it. And because I think we have an issue here. And then if you can't get anywhere, the best thing to do is, if you want to fight with them, is to file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Okay. So you write down everything that has happened to you that is problematic, that's discriminatory, that is damaging, painful, and basically keep documentation of the things that happened to you, so that you can write down these histories. And if they agree that you've been discriminated against, they will give you what is called a right to sue letter. Okay. And then you can take that if you want to, you can take that back to your employer and say, these are the things that are happening. The EEOC says I have a right to sue. I don't want to do that.
Right.
I want to stay here. I will tear up this letter if you will help me.
And it's tough to be in that position because
It is.
it's like you're kind of using leverage, and you're asking yourself, is this going to be worth it in the end?
Right.
So it's hard to be in that situation for sure.
So the first famous trans man in the United States was a guy named Steve Dane. He passed away in 2007. But in 1976, he transitioned, and in 1977, he lost his job as a girls' PE teacher in a high school in Emeryville, California. And he fought for it. And he won, but he could never actually get them to comply with the ultimate court order. So he ended up having a new career, and ultimately, in addition to his new career as a chiropractor, teaching at a community college and stuff. So he still got to teach, but and that was many years later.
Yeah.
And the society had changed a fair amount, and we had some non-discrimination ordinances in city levels, but he didn't have anything like that in the 70s. And he was the first trans man that I ever saw.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was very impressive. Very impressive.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, the trailblazer role, I have props for anybody who does that. I mean, not everybody should have to be that trailblazer, but
right.
I know a lot of trans folks who are definitely we're hard-nosed, very motivated people. So one other resource I'll mention is MAP, or the Movement Advancement.
Yes, great resources.
Yeah. Well, and so some places like Kansas, it's illegal to change your gender marker regardless. I'm sure back when you were transitioning, in order to change anything on anything, you probably had to go through, surgical procedures first. And I won't ask about your personal medical transition, but where are we today? What's the general temperature of the nation? We've got folks commenting about the fact that they're public school teachers, or they work for the state in a red state, what kind of, just generally, what's the temperature? What's going on?
Well, in the country, people who are hostile to trans people are hiding behind these state legislative efforts that are hostile to trans people. And they're using the fact that they exist to justify their own actions that they take independently, because they don't have a right to discriminate in the way that they do. And if they're in a school or that's getting federal funding, Title IX, the ruling in Bostock has been applied to Title IX, so as well as Title VII. So that discrimination is illegal. And you document the discrimination, file a complaint. But that's a long process, and sometimes not always, satisfying. Sure. But those are the things that have to happen to some extent. But again, it's about relationships. Right. If you can get somebody to listen to you because they have some compassion for you, then you've got your foot in the door, and you can gradually change their position if they have the compassion to listen. Right. And some people just won't, and they are getting permission to be like that by our super divisive culture right now. Yeah. And that's a really hard thing. But WPATH, I wrote a position for them on identity recognition, first time in 2010, and it's been updated and expanded again in 2016, and then 2019 or 18 or 19. But it's a state public policy statement on identity recognition. WPATH says no surgery should be required of anyone in order to recognize their identity. None. But WPATH people, WPATH doesn't really have any clout other than their reputation. And usually it's courts of law that respect the reputation, or it might be a practitioner somewhere, or it might be a business manager who's been reading up on this stuff and sees, oh, everybody's citing WPATH, it must be something important. But WPATH doesn't have, we don't have badges. We can't go out and arrest people because they've been discriminatory or anything.
Certainly. Well, and by the way, I misspoke earlier when I mentioned MAP. It's the Movement Advancement Project. But anyway.
I thought that's what you said.
Yeah.
MAP.
Yeah, of course. It is what I said.
It is.
But, so like in spite of, or despite Bostock and despite all the great, lengths we've gone as far as, the DSM-5s, getting rid of some of the terrible things in the ICD, no longer calling, transgenderism a medical or a mental condition, but a physical condition. We don't have like widespread protection for trans folks, let alone, medical, health laws about health insurance.
Right.
There are places, like I said, where it's still illegal to change your gender marker. A lot of legislatures right now are also looking to pass some pretty vicious laws targeting trans children, especially. And
criminalizing doctors too.
Right. Yeah. So doctors have to feel threatened for providing hormone replacement therapy to children. And in some places, I think Arkansas, even the governor tried to veto that bill. Or wrote his veto. The legislature voted more than 2/3 to override the veto on that. So it's really a crazy time. And, I feel for folks who live in places where they really feel the pressure of that culture war. And they feel that pressure of just the negativity that's out there. So, what kind of hope can you spread? What kind of sunshine can we cast on this situation?
When I think back to what things were like in the 70s, when Steve Dane lost his job, when I think about, just when I think about the first case where we started to chip away at what later became the Bostock decision, chip away at a constitutional or a national statute that was protective. The attitudes were completely different, and there was no consciousness whatsoever. What you see now, what we're dealing with now, is this polarization that didn't exist before. I mean, in some individuals it did, if they were really knee-jerk kind of people, and those are the people who are banding together on this one side now to create these laws and give no credence whatsoever to transgender existence. That's those people. We have to believe those people are going to lose. Those people are going to lose, because the difference that in acceptance that we have now, even though there wasn't that polarization 50 years ago, there was opposition, but it wasn't as polarized as it is now. And people would listen. And trans people didn't, put it in your face all the time. They just tried to live their life. That was all it was about. Just live the life, live your life. And, we have to deal with the social media where people feel barraged by things that they don't want to see, but they can't stop themselves from looking.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. And we can't control that. But I think if we keep a balanced perspective in our personal life, and we take on the things that we know that we can handle, and we develop the relationships with people that are supportive, and as much as possible, if you can, just keep your distance from those people who are not supportive, and don't go looking for fights, but look for allies, look for support.
Yeah. Well, and if I had
And
to,
I think we can win. I think we will overpower these people who have these ideas, because people are seeing, more and more reasonable people are seeing how irrational these people are. And if you look at the abortion law that just got passed in Texas, people are, regardless, many people who are anti-abortion are recognizing how irrational that law is and how dangerous it is. And they can extrapolate and see how that applies to how their attitudes towards other people like us.
well, and too, like you can always get involved with if you feel comfortable. I mean, coming out is a huge thing. Transitioning is a huge thing.
Yeah.
You got to get over what can feel like mountains sometimes before you really start to get active. But I know I've done a lot of lobbying with, Planned Parenthood. I've done lobbying with, HRC. I've done lobbying just with my own, federal U.S. legislators. But, in honor of next month, it's National Coming Out Day.
Right.
We had a question from the audience who said, kind of in honor of that, what would you tell a young professional trans and non-binary person who's on their first job, who's afraid to come out? What would be your words of wisdom for them?
I think people need to be very, very conscious of what their tolerance level is, what their own personal bandwidth is. The best thing to do about being resistant, someone who's resistant to come out, is assure them that they'll not be forced to come out. But trust me, if they do come out, while it might be a little, scary at first, and they will feel ultimately so much better down the road. Being honest about who you are is really, really helpful to building the relationships that you need to do to be successful in life, in every aspect of your life.
It's so true. I mean, it's like this whole shell that you just peel off, and then you just start to learn. Like for me, it's like, wow, I'm learning, since I came out, I've learned so much about myself that I don't think I ever would have, even discovered until I gave myself the room, to be who I am and work toward that. So I do just want to invite folks in the last few minutes. We'll probably go until about 8:45 Eastern time. So I would like to invite folks to put their questions in the chat if anybody has any more questions. But if there was one thing, James, that you really felt you needed to say about this, what would it be?
We can't give up. We can't give up. If in our quest to be ourselves, to be who we are, to have a place that's safe for us in the world, which is, for the rest of our lives, which means when we get old, like me, or older than me, that you'll be safe in the world. We can't give up. We can't give up. And because if we can do that for ourselves, we'll be making it safer for the young people coming behind us. And believe me, when I started out, nobody, and this was true in the gay community too, people didn't come out in high school, rarely, but in the 50s or 60s. People didn't come out until they got away from home because they were scared to death of what their parents would say. Now right. People are coming out when they're 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Right. And parents are hearing them, and parents are listening. And that would not have happened if we had not been out.
That's it. I mean, it's true. And you think about it, it's like, because you are a fighter, you are, you're a game changer, you're a trailblazer. And it's really, to think that one day, maybe there won't be something called transitioning in the workplace, or if it right. is, it's just normalized,
Yep. That's my goal, basically. That is where it should be. There shouldn't have to be guides all over the place. There shouldn't have to be, 2-hour trainings. There's we should be able to live our lives like anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. So, we've got a few questions here, and forgive me, somebody I think Corinne threw in the one that I missed further up the thread. But I'd like to take this one first, because I actually know somebody who's kind of in a similar situation. So, folks who are kind of in the public eye before they transition. We have somebody who is just, they're 42, first person working for a red state to come out and transition at work. Most likely will have the press involved. How should I approach that?
Well, again, it's about relationships. If you have a relationship with somebody in the press, give them an exclusive.
That's an interesting idea.
It's a thought.
Yeah.
The other, be sure you have your support system behind you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, I know some folks who, like, famous actors and other individuals who are, some level of notoriety. They definitely, tried to kind of fast track their transition or kind of get parts of their transition done kind of behind the scenes. I know you can do laser or electrolysis and hormone replacement therapy. If those are things you think are part of your transition, you can do those kind of without really making them obvious or public.
Yes. That's true. All of that is true.
Changing names and gender markers, that might be another story.
That's like a birth announcement.
Right. Right.
Exactly. There's no getting around it. It's going to be public in some way.
Exactly. So, in your experience, we had another question. What sort of general attitudes are most helpful when encountering a difficult coworker? How would you recommend, like, diffusing a situation? Do you use humor? Do you kind of walk away and talk to your manager? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I can't really say something that's going to apply in every situation because interpersonal dynamics, the context is so variable. So you have to read that relationship. You have to read that situation and decide for yourself. My personal inclination is to try to diffuse things. Mm-hmm. It's to try to engage in a way that inspires their compassion. One thing I did have one person at work in my when I was first announcing to people in my little circle at work, I went to the guy who got the other job that I had been considered for, because he and I had started on the same day. And so we knew each other, and there was a chance that, I just needed to include him in that conversation. So I went into his office and I said, I have something personal I need to discuss with you. I'm going to be a candidate for surgical sex reassignment. And he just burst out laughing. I mean, and then I saw on the credenza behind him, he had a picture of his wife and 2 little kids. And I played, and part of me is ashamed of this, but it was my gut thing. What's going to connect with this guy? And I said, I have a female partner at home, and we have 1 child and another on the way. And he just sobered up immediately and goes, oh, well, you're doing the right thing then, because then I wouldn't be gay anymore, right? So it's disgusting and wrong, but it was what saved me in that moment. And sometimes you have to do that thing and then work on changing the attitude later.
Wow. Yeah, that's a wild story. But thank you. I mean, it's so true. You can't really generalize about something like that. Every relationship is different. Every dynamic is different. but you just thought on your toes and you did good. And that's such a good point, to try to reach somebody where they're at. That's kind of empathy, and that's kind of also that, kind of standing up for yourself at the same time, but just really trying, what do you do or say that's going to help show empathy toward that person, at the same time, saying, look, this is me,
Right.
to it, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it's hard to predict. I mean, I can't say, oh, this is a tactic that's going to work all the time. It's,
Sure.
People are different all
Right.
over the place.
Right.
And so again, it's the relationships that lead to success.
Yeah. Well, and feeling things out. I think at the underlying concept here is that you've really got to feel out a situation, use your resources. Somebody asked, should I have a lawyer ready when I go to HR? Some folks have saying, should I approach the boss first, or HR, or both at the same time? I don't know about you, but I'd recommend first seeing if that company has a policy. I mean, definitely, to your point earlier, look at their equal opportunity policy, then start researching. I know when I started working at my employer, I went on and I used our intranet and searched transgender just to see what came up. And they did, in fact, have a very outdated transgender guidelines, but again, understanding that we can't generalize. I mean, we just had a question from somebody that said, do you know how Title IX works in regard to living in a right to work state? Pennsylvania is a right to work state, by the way.
It's Title VII. Title IX has to do with education.
Title
VII has to do with employment.
Right.
And the right to work state, basically they have a right to fire you without notice or cause. Right. But if you know that you have been discriminated against, that law still applies.
Yeah.
If you suspect and can prove that they decided to cut you because you were trans, then you may have a case.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe having a lawyer.
I don't know that you need a lawyer ready before you make your announcement. And in terms of choosing, should you talk to your manager first or should you talk to HR first? If they have a policy that says talk to HR first, then you should talk to HR first. If you have a good relationship with your boss, talk to your boss first. And then ask your boss if they would go with you to HR. I mean, just a thought. You don't have to do that. If it feels right, use the support systems that you can develop, that you have. If you can find them and develop them, use them.
And I know people who have done that, just what you said there, who've gone to HR and then or their boss, either way, and then said, hey, can you come talk with this other person? And you made a good point earlier that I just want to reiterate around, a company should, best practice would be, that trans person doesn't have to be in the room when HR or the manager comes and kind of teaches their coworkers about what's happening.
That's right.
Really important. For
some people might want to be there because they have a good working relationship with everyone, and they want to reinforce the idea that not only do they approve of this educational program, but they want to be able to answer questions if people have them.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I'm going to throw your website back in the chat again one more time. Also remind folks about the many other resources out there. Trevor Project has a lot of good statistics. HRC, workplace at hrc.org.
National Center for Transgender Equality also.
Yes, exactly.
Transrights.org.
Exactly. And a lot of these resources.
Transequality.org, I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And a lot of these resources you can find on the Eastern PA Trans Equity Project website as well. But check out Dr. Green's book at jamisongreen.com. I just want to thank everybody for joining, and thank you, for joining us tonight. If you had any parting sentiments, what would it be?
Well, I'm just so happy to have been invited to speak to you all, and I look forward to the day when I can visit Pennsylvania again. And I wish everyone the absolute best, and and hopefully you won't run into discrimination. Please, that's my wish for everybody, that we can just live our lives and thrive as much as anyone else.